They were 28 souls on the edge of everything, young, restless, and ready to leave their sleepy Montana town behind. On June 9th, 2001, the senior class of Mill Creek Academy boarded a school bus for one final adventure before adulthood. They never arrived. No crash, no calls, no clues, just silence, and a haunting that would ripple across decades. For 22 years, their disappearance became legend, a warning, a wound. But when a rusted bus was discovered deep in the Black Bear Preserve, half consumed by forest, the truth began to stir. Not a tragedy, not an accident, a message. And as the layers peeled back, one by one, what emerged was not just horror, but something ancient, alive, and waiting. This is not just the story of what was lost, it's the story of what we forgot, and what has finally remembered us. The morning air over Mill Creek shimmered with the quiet anticipation of a long-awaited ending. It was June 9th, 2001, a Saturday that smelled of pine resin, diesel, and teenage dreams finally taking flight. At the edge of the school's parking lot, a faded yellow school bus waited like a rusted relic from a simpler era, humming softly beneath the rising Montana sun. It was the last ride, the final memory before everyone scattered into adulthood. College, jobs, escape. 26 students from Mill Creek Academy's senior class stood clustered near the bus, tossing duffel bags, swapping jokes, and scribbling signatures on each other's yearbooks. The parking lot buzzed with unspoken tension, not because anything seemed wrong. No, that would have been too easy. But because this was a moment none of them realized would calcify in time forever. Devin Carter, the quiet boy with a secondhand camera slung around his neck, captured it all. He was a loner with a passion for documenting moments people forgot to notice. That morning, he panned across the faces of his classmates, stopping on the golden-haired twins laughing at their own inside joke, then on Micah Palmer, the soccer star juggling an apple like a ball, and finally on Layla Jang, seated on the curb, scribbling furiously in her sketchbook. Layla never spoke much, but her art had a haunting quality that made people uncomfortable. She'd recently begun drawing trees, twisted, gnarled, roots like fingers. And when asked why, she simply whispered, "They come to me in dreams." No one took it seriously, of course. Dreams were just that, until they weren't. At 9:27 a.m., the bus doors creaked open. Behind the wheel sat a substitute driver no one recognized, a gaunt man with graying stubble and dark sunglasses who introduced himself only as Mr. Griggs. The regular driver, Mr. Holloway, had called out sick late the night before, and no one questioned the replacement. Why would they? Authority wears many faces, and no one taught teenagers to challenge one that came in a uniform. Mr. Griggs said little, only nodded as students filed in, some blasting music from flip phones, others tossing popcorn at each other. Devin took the back seat, as always, and filmed through the dirty window as parents waved from the sidewalk. Mrs. Wu wiped her eyes while holding up a sign that read, "Come back with stories." She would later regret not holding her daughter Rachel just one more time. At exactly 9:42 a.m., the doors hissed shut, and the engine groaned to life. The bus rumbled down the two-lane highway, swallowed slowly by a tunnel of fir trees leading into the Black Bear National Preserve, a place known for its beauty, remoteness, and spotty reception. Their destination was Clearwater Creek, a secluded campsite nestled beyond ranger trails, chosen specifically for its isolation. A reward, the teacher said, for surviving 12 years of education. The last footage Devin recorded that morning was of the sun slicing through the trees like gold knives, then cutting abruptly as the battery light blinked red. That would be the final image anyone ever saw of the Mill Creek seniors, alive. At 7:06 p.m., the camp ranger checked his log. No bus, no students, just a note scribbled the day before. Expected, Mill Creek Academy, 28 packs, overnight. At 8:41 p.m., Rachel Wu's mother received a voicemail. Garbled laughter, static, a voice whispering, "Turn it off," followed by a sharp silence and no goodbye. By midnight, when the school tried to call Mr. Griggs, they learned no such driver was ever assigned. Mr. Holloway had never called out sick. The transportation company had no record of the replacement. Panic erupted like a wildfire. But by the time search teams arrived at dawn, it was too late. The rain had begun, hard, violent, and unrelenting. Any tire tracks had been erased. No scent for the dogs to follow. No trail cameras picked up the vehicle. The forest had swallowed them, whole and soundless. By Monday, national news covered the story. 26 students and 2 staff vanish en route to graduation trip. Conspiracies spiraled like smoke. Accident, cult abduction, students staging their own disappearance. But none of it explained the truth, the complete void. For the next 2 decades, Mill Creek became a town frozen in mourning. Memorials were built, classrooms renamed, beds left untouched, and yet, not a single piece of evidence ever surfaced. Until June 3rd, 2023. That was when a hunter named Wade Langley veered off his usual path, chasing an injured deer, and spotted something yellow through the ferns. A school bus, half buried in moss, windows shattered, the number #17 barely legible through the grime. And inside, the ghosts of that final ride waited. Some more visible than others. Wade Langley hadn't planned to hike that far. A seasoned hunter and Vietnam veteran, he prided himself on knowing every inch of the Black Bear Preserve. But that morning, something in the air had felt off. Still, humid, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. He'd followed a wounded buck's blood trail past familiar markers until the foliage thickened unnaturally, as if the forest was pressing inward. That's when he saw it. Through a curtain of moss and vine, a flash of yellow dulled by decades of decay. The closer he stepped, the more the shape emerged. A school bus, its frame rusted into the earth, half-eaten by ivy and shadow. Windows were cracked, their glass fogged by time and mildew. One door hung open, the other sealed shut with vines as thick as wrists. The number on the side, #17, was nearly erased, but still visible enough to summon the cold rush of recognition. Wade's heart tightened. He didn't have kids, but even he remembered the story, the missing students, the whispers, the theories. Hands trembling, he stepped inside. The air was foul, stale with rot and something older, something animal. Seats were torn. Ivy snaked through broken window panes, crawling along the ceiling like veins. And scattered across the floor lay artifacts of lives frozen in time. A Walkman warped from moisture, a varsity jacket with the name Maicha, barely legible, a shoe with cartoon stickers peeling from its side. But it was what lay at the back that stopped him. A pile of collapsed luggage racks, crushed backpacks, and beneath them, bones. Some fully exposed, others tangled in remnants of fabric, flesh long gone. He stumbled out of the bus and retched violently. Then, he pulled out his satellite phone. By nightfall, law enforcement had sealed the site. Helicopters buzzed overhead. Forensic tents rose between trees. The media descended like vultures, but the authorities said little. There were bones, multiple sets, items belonging to the missing students. That was all. But behind closed doors, investigators whispered, why was the bus so deep inside a part of the preserve with no road access? Why no tire marks? Why no tree damage? No sign of impact? It hadn't crashed there. It had been placed. Deliberately. Meanwhile, in a quiet cul-de-sac across the state, Irene Zhang, mother of Layla, sat alone in her living room when her landline rang. No one called her landline anymore. Her hand trembled as she lifted the receiver. Static. Then a whisper. They're still here. Click. The line went dead. 2 days later, forensic analysts discovered a sketchbook hidden beneath the driver's seat, wrapped in deteriorated fabric. The pages were warped, the ink smeared, but some images remained intact. One sketch showed figures in a circle beneath the trees, holding hands around a fire. Another depicted hooded silhouettes with no faces, their bodies blending into the trunks of trees. But the final page, scrawled with the jagged charcoal strokes, was the most disturbing. The bus itself, surrounded by monstrous outlines, with something wearing a mask seated behind the wheel. The name in the corner, Layla Z. Her remains were not among those recovered. When news broke that the bus had been found, families were thrust back into grief and chaos. Many clung to hope that their children might still be alive, but others, like Irene, began to unravel. She hadn't moved a single item in Layla's bedroom for 22 years. Her daughter's last voicemail still sat saved on a cassette recorder. That night, she pressed play again. For years, the recording had been the same. Background laughter, wind, Rachel's voice saying, "Turn that off." But this time, it sounded different, as if something had been embedded beneath the noise. Irene raised the volume. Behind the static, barely audible, a whisper. "You weren't supposed to find us." She dropped the recorder. Her breath caught. It wasn't Rachel's voice. It wasn't Layla's. It was something else. The next morning, an anonymous package was delivered to the sheriff's office, a copy of the original 2001 senior class video, filmed by Devin Carter, with no return address. It was heavily degraded, warped from age and damp, but one frame stood out. Right before the footage cuts, Devin's camera catches the substitute driver staring into the rearview mirror, and for a split second, the reflection isn't human. His glasses are gone. His eyes are hollow sockets. The video ends in a flicker of black. Investigators immediately tried to locate Devin's family, only to learn his parents had died in a car crash in 2015 and he had no living relatives on record. But then, on June 14th, a gaunt man walked into the Missoula Police Department wearing a moldy Mill Creek jacket and whispered to the officer at the front desk, "I'm Devin Carter. I need to talk to someone before they find me." He was pale, almost translucent, as if he hadn't seen sunlight in years. His voice trembled. His gaze never stayed in one place for long. When asked for ID, he said he didn't have any. "They took everything," he murmured. "They stripped us down, made us forget. But I remember now. I wasn't supposed to. But when I saw the news, it all came back. The bus, the fire, the roots." That night, Devin was placed under medical observation, heavily sedated. But as he lay in the hospital bed, murmuring names of his lost classmates in his sleep, a nurse swore she heard him whisper, "It wasn't a trip, it was a harvest." And in a padded envelope beneath his coat, they found a hand-drawn map. It led to somewhere deeper, somewhere still untouched by the search teams. A place circled in red ink, labeled in shaky writing, Mother Root. The sketch was crude, charcoal lines smeared with sweat or rain, perhaps both. But the message was unmistakable. In the center of the hand-drawn map was a knot of crooked trees, circled twice in red ink and marked with two trembling words, Mother Root. Around it sprawled broken lines labeled with names like Hollow Trail, Silent Ridge, and Vein Split, none of which appeared on any official maps of Black Bear National Preserve. What unsettled investigators the most wasn't the geography. It was the detail. The map included elevation markers, distances to sun-bleached boulders, even the slope of shadows at certain times of day. This hadn't been scribbled from memory. It had been lived. Devin Carter lay sedated under medical supervision, twitching beneath his blankets, his murmurs growing louder as dusk crept into the hospital corridors. He repeated names. Layla, Rachel, Travis, Nina, some clear, some slurred. But every few minutes he whispered another word, over and over, like a fevered mantra, cleanse. Cleanse, cleanse. When detectives showed him the map hours later, his eyes flared wide, as if yanked from some terrible dream. "That's where they took us," he croaked. "That's where it grows." No one dared ask what it meant. A task force was assembled at dawn. Rangers, forensic teams, local police, and one anthropologist from Helena followed the path marked by Devin's map. The deeper they hiked, the more unnatural the forest felt. Birds stopped singing. The wind ceased. Trees grew in tight spirals, roots twisted above ground like skeletal hands clawing at air. After nearly 4 hours off-trail, they reached a clearing, unnaturally circular, as if carved from the earth itself. At its center stood an ancient tree, gnarled and massive, its trunk hollowed into a dark cavity. Ivy clung to its bark like old skin. The roots of the tree stretched outward in thick cords, dozens of them disappearing beneath the forest floor. Symbols were carved into the bark, unfamiliar runes, angular and sharp, some scorched black. The anthropologist, Dr. Elise Warren, stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "This tree, it's not native. This species doesn't exist in Montana. I don't think it exists anywhere." That's when one of the rangers found the bones. Buried just beneath a moss-covered slab, half a dozen femurs arranged in a perfect spiral, each one scorched at the ends. Nearby, another ranger unearthed a decayed leather-bound book filled with handwritten passages, signed only as J.C. The entries were dates and names, all matching missing students. One page read, "Emily resisted, offered at waning moon, reclaimed by soil." Another, "Tyler wept, marked unclean, taken at dusk, one less tether to past." The final entry was dated October 2002, more than a year after the class disappeared. It simply read, "Devin fled, marked incomplete, circle broken. Mother waits." Back at headquarters, officers pressed Devin for answers. He sat motionless for long minutes before finally speaking. "The bus died. Engine just stopped. We waited, but then they came. His voice cracked. Not just the cult, not just the chosen, the thing under the tree, the root. They worshipped it, fed it, said it was older than time, said it needed minds that hadn't been poisoned by the world. Pure minds. We weren't kids to them, we were offerings. Devin trembled, his nails digging into his palms. They fed it dreams, emotions, us, and it fed them something back. Visions, strength, longevity. That's why they never aged. The detectives looked at each other, skeptical. But Devin continued. They called it the mother root, said the forest was alive because she was. And once you were chosen, you either surrendered or were repurposed. His breath hitched. The screaming never stopped, not for months. And some nights I think I still hear it. That night, Devin tried to claw his way out of his hospital room. He was found in the hallway, bloodied and delirious, muttering, "She's awake. She knows I broke the circle." The hospital transferred him to a secure psychiatric wing. Investigators, unsure whether to treat his words as delusion or warning, doubled security at the dig site. Meanwhile, forensic analysts re-examined the bones recovered from the bus and found something chilling. Hairline cuts on the ribs of several victims, suggesting surgical precision. These weren't animal scavenging marks. They were human, or worse. And then came the photograph. Recovered from a water-damaged disposable camera found near the site, it showed blurry students around a campfire, smiling, unaware. But in the background, barely visible, was a figure, tall, robed, with a face that wasn't a face at all, just a smooth surface where features should be. A faceless watcher, a sentinel. The photograph sent ripples of horror through the task force. Doctor. Warren quietly handed in her resignation and left town that evening. The lead investigator woke in the night to find strange runes carved into his front door. And across Mill Creek, streetlights flickered for the first time in years. The air thickened. Something had shifted. The bus had returned. Devin had returned. But so had something else. The forest was no longer dormant. And Mother Root was no longer a sleep dot. The forest had grown colder since the bus was found. Rangers who had walked those woods their whole lives now refused to enter without backup. Reports of missing wildlife grew common, whole herds of elk vanishing from camera traps, birdsong gone silent even at dawn. And then there were the dreams. Deputy Mason Reese, a 14-year veteran of the Mill Creek Sheriff's Department, hadn't slept more than 2 hours a night since the map surfaced. Not because of paperwork or pressure, but because each time he closed his eyes, he saw faces. Familiar teenage faces, staring through cracked glass, mouthing words he couldn't hear. On the third night, he woke to find mud-caked footprints leading from his front door to his bed, stopping inches from his face. The forensics team confirmed, human, barefoot, size consistent with a teenage male, and yet his security system hadn't triggered. Cameras recorded static for precisely 1 hour and 17 minutes. Beginning at 3:33 a.m., the same hour Rachel Wu's voicemail had been time-stamped 22 years earlier. Across town, Mrs. Santos, whose daughter Nina was among the missing, found her garden torn apart. Every petal from the rose bushes Nina had once planted had been carefully removed and laid in a spiral at her back door. No footprints, no fingerprints, just the faint scent of iron and soil. Authorities chalked it up to vandalism, but deep down, everyone knew better. Something had been disturbed, and now it was searching. In the secure psychiatric facility 2 counties over, Devin Carter had fallen into a trance-like silence. Days passed where he didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe through his mouth. Nurses said he seemed stiller than normal people, as if gravity pressed differently on his bones. But on the 7th day, he spoke again. Slowly, clearly, and with eyes that no longer looked entirely human. "You think you found the bodies," he said to the night nurse, "but you didn't find us." The nurse asked who he meant. Devin smiled faintly, as though remembering something from far away. "The ones who chose to stay, the ones who became part of her." The nurse backed away, unnerved by the calm in his voice. But Devin only tilted his head and whispered, "The circle was never meant to be broken. You called them back." That same night, trail cam footage from the perimeter of the dig site caught movement. 13 figures, pale, barefoot, silently weaving between trees. Their eyes reflected no light. Their limbs moved with a jerking grace, like dancers pulled by invisible strings. In one frame, one of them paused, turned, and looked directly into the camera. It was Nina Santos, or something that wore her face. Her features were intact, unaged, but her expression, hollow. Not blank, in a hollow. The footage was time-stamped at 3:33 a.m. again. By now, the pattern had become impossible to ignore, but no one wanted to say it aloud. The class of 2001 hadn't been entirely lost. Some had never left the forest, or worse, they had become of it. At the task force command post near the forest's edge, tensions grew. Dr. Warren was gone, but she left behind a note scribbled in Latin, translated roughly to, "Those who root beneath do not die, they grow." Her reference logs traced Mother Root's origins not to any known species, but to folklore from pre-Columbian tribes in the region. Stories of a womb tree that whispered to children, luring them into the soil to become her saplings. The tribes had long since vanished, no written records remained. But in the oral traditions recorded by ethnographers, the phrase "chosen by the root" appeared multiple times, always connected to mass disappearances, always near forests that no longer existed. Meanwhile, back in Mill Creek, Jared Boone, the younger brother of one of the missing students, returned home after years away. He was only 7 when his sister disappeared, but he remembered her laugh, her hair, the way she used to draw suns with angry faces. He never stopped searching. When news of the bus broke, he drove 18 hours straight, arriving with nothing but a backpack and a notebook full of clippings. He demanded to speak with Devin. At first, the hospital refused, but after an unexplainable overnight systems crash that corrupted all their patient files, only Devin's, they relented. When Jared entered the padded room, Devin looked up and said, before a word was spoken, "You brought the drawing?" Jared froze. No one knew about the drawing. It was the last thing his sister had made, found under her bed, of a tree with open eyes and arms like branches. "How do you know?" Jared whispered. Devin closed his eyes. Because she was the first to hear her voice. And then he said something else, a name. One Jared had never heard aloud, but had seen written at the bottom corner of the drawing in faded pencil. Verelda. The word echoed in Jared's mind like a chime struck underwater. He didn't ask what it meant. Deep down, he knew. That night, Jared went to the clearing alone. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and the drawing, he entered the woods at 3 a.m. He was never seen again. But at 3:33 a.m., the trail cams captured a new image. Jared, standing at the base of the mother root, smiling gently. His eyes were shut. In his hand, the drawing. Behind him, 13 others began to form a circle, and above them, in the branches, something massive stirred, something that had been sleeping. And now, because the circle was whole again, it had begun to wake Dot. By sunrise, the clearing was empty again. No Jared, no circle, no trace. The rangers sent to investigate found only one thing left behind in the soft, mossy soil, a page from Jared's notebook, its edges singed, its ink smeared, but still legible. She was waiting to be complete. "We were the roots. We always were." That single sentence sent a tremor through the task force. Overnight, something had changed in the air around Mill Creek. Power lines buzzed with static interference. Dogs barked at nothing. Phones rang once and then fell silent with no caller. And every clock in the sheriff's office stopped at precisely 3:33 a.m. No one said the word curse, not yet, but it hung in the room like invisible fog. At the psychiatric hospital, Devin Carter screamed for the first time in days, bolting upright, eyes wide, mouth gaping in terror as he gasped. She opened her eyes. He then collapsed into unconsciousness, his vitals normal, but his brain activity off the charts. Doctors said he was in a waking coma, a state they couldn't explain. In a desperate move, the task force brought in a woman named Dr. Alina Norwood, a folklore archivist from the University of Washington, who had been researching off-the-record cult movements in the Pacific Northwest for over a decade. When shown Layla's drawings, the map, and Jared's notebook page, she turned pale. "This isn't isolated," she said quietly. "I've seen these runes before, carved into a stone altar in northern Idaho. Same spiral pattern. Same ritual drawings. They called it the 13th seed." She explained that every generation, certain wooded areas acted like magnets for what she called geo-spiritual parasitism. Not exactly spirits, not living things, but entities that fed off memory, belief, and devotion. "You don't disappear into the forest," she whispered. "The forest disappears into you." She insisted on being taken to the clearing immediately. Claiming the entity known as Mother Root could only be understood through proximity, she went with 2 officers. Only one came back. The other was found 3 hours later, blind, shaking, with leaves stuffed into his mouth and fingernails torn off. He couldn't speak. He only pointed at his chest and mouthed the word empty over and over. Dr. Norwood, however, returned unnaturally calm. She didn't answer questions. She just requested to be alone with Devon. For 2 hours, the hospital hallway remained silent. Then, at precisely 3:33 p.m., 12 hours inverted from the usual pattern, Devon sat up, eyes open, lucid, and said in a voice that wasn't his, "You broke the soil again. She's spreading." Then he collapsed once more. Surveillance footage later showed something else, a split-second black blur crossing behind the window of his room at exactly that moment. The security system glitched for 7 seconds. In town, more families of the missing began receiving strange packages. Mrs. Zhang opened a small wooden box one morning to find Layla's old bracelet, the one she wore every day, resting on a bed of black moss. Alongside it, a note, not in Layla's handwriting, but with her signature, "Don't come looking. The soil remembers." A different family, the Vances, whose son Jeremy was among the missing, received a Polaroid showing their front porch, taken from outside, in the dark. In the image, Jeremy stood in the foreground. Behind him, barely visible, was something tall, too tall, slender, but rooted into the floorboards. Its head was tilted toward the boy, like a withered flower. They moved out of Mill Creek that night, but by the time they reached the highway, their car was found empty, doors open, engine running. No signs of struggle, only 3 sets of footprints, 2 small, 1 enormous, leading back toward the tree line. Sheriff Halston, who had never believed in the occult, finally snapped. At the emergency town council meeting, he slammed his badge on the table and said, "This thing isn't human. It doesn't care about closure or justice. It wants silence. It wants us to stop asking." The mayor tried to dismiss his fears, but the vote was clear. A mandatory evacuation zone was declared around the forest perimeter. Too late. That night, the fog returned, thicker than ever, rolling through streets and homes like a tide. Streetlights blinked and died. Emergency lines rang endlessly, but connected to silence. And, at exactly 3:33 a.m., a sound tore through Mill Creek like a wound being ripped open, low, guttural, almost organic. It was not an animal. It was not mechanical. It was the sound of something ancient, waking up. The final emergency broadcast recorded before the towers failed was just 7 words, spoken in a distorted voice that sounded like Devon's, and yet not. "The circle is whole, the root breathes," then static, and the forest swallowed the town again. At dawn, Mill Creek was unrecognizable. The town that had once thrived on routine, morning coffee at Dina's diner, school bells ringing, porch lights flicking on at dusk, now stood hollowed, like a corpse drained of memory. Fog clung to everything. Streets, trees, even skin. The birds hadn't returned. No dogs barked. Emergency vehicles sat abandoned mid-intersection, their lights still pulsing, casting red and blue ghosts against the buildings. The sheriff's office, once the beating heart of law and order, was silent. Inside, the dispatch radio looped the same 3-second static burst every 11 minutes, interrupted only by a faint whisper that no one had been able to decode. But the most disturbing change was the trees. Overnight, black saplings had sprouted across town, through sidewalks, in bedrooms, from rooftops. They pulsed faintly, their bark wet and veined, their roots reaching downward into concrete like knives through butter. They weren't part of the natural world, and they were growing. Fast. In the cleared field beyond the forest's edge, the task force had set up what was meant to be a final staging area, a perimeter, a line in the soil they swore not to cross again. But even there, strange things happened. Cameras recorded footage that no one remembered filming. People walking through camp at night with eyes that glowed silver. Equipment failed without explanation. Radios emitted what sounded like children giggling, followed by sharp, ear-splitting feedback. Doctor. Alina Norwood, once composed and clinical, had stopped speaking entirely. She sat in a folding chair facing the tree line, sketching over and over the same image. A ring of people with hands raised to the sky, and above them, something rooted but alive, with limbs like branches and a face like an open mouth. She titled it Ascension. When asked what it meant, she simply murmured, "It's not the end. It's the bloom. Meanwhile, Devin Carter remained in his comatose state, but his brain activity spiked each night precisely at 3:33 a.m., matching the rising sap pressure in the black trees, which forensic botanists, if they could still be called that, measured as increasing in perfect sync with him. Whatever was happening in Mill Creek wasn't just a haunting. It was a synchronization, a reawakening. Across town, survivors still holding out began to change. Mrs. Santos, who had once pleaded with the sheriff for answers, now walked barefoot through her yard, humming songs no one recognized, her hands dripping with soil, her eyes unfocused. When her sister tried to speak to her, she turned slowly and said, "Nina told me we were wrong to grieve. She's not lost. She's planted." The sister left town that night, never arrived home. Her phone was found in a ditch, still recording audio. Nearly 6 minutes of whispers and something that sounded like roots pushing through wet earth. But it was the school that became the next focal point. Mill Creek Academy, long since closed and left to rot, suddenly flickered with light one night, power restored without connection. A group of officers entered at sunrise to investigate and found every classroom rearranged with precision, desks in perfect circles, books open to blank pages, and vines growing out of blackboards. In the auditorium, on the stage where graduation would have taken place 22 years earlier, sat 26 chairs. In them, 26 uniforms. Each student's original name tag rested on the chest, stitched in with red thread. Behind the podium, pinned against the curtain, was the faded class photo from 2001. Except this time, everyone in the image had their eyes scratched out, except for one, Devin Carter, and someone had scrawled beneath it, "He broke the circle." She sees through him now. When they showed the image to Devin, his eyes opened wide. He began to convulse, screaming in a voice not entirely his own. "She wants to finish it. It was supposed to be a perfect bloom. I ran, I ruined it. They were meant to be hers. Now she's reaching further. She's rooting through time." The doctors sedated him, but not before he added one last sentence. "She doesn't need all of us anymore. Just enough to spread." That night, the mayor's home was found hollowed out, literally. Not broken into, hollowed. The walls stood, but the furniture, belongings, even structural beams had dissolved into mulch. The floors soaked in a fluid that smelled faintly like cinnamon and rot. No signs of the mayor or his family. Just a single seed pod, pulsing like a heartbeat, placed carefully on the kitchen table. It split open at 3:33 a.m. That was the final warning the task force received before most of them packed up and fled. But a few stayed. Dr. Norwood, Deputy Reese, 2 agents from Homeland Security sent too late. They had one goal: go into the forest and find the mother root, destroy it if possible, sever the tether. They entered at dusk. Only one came out. He was barefoot, bleeding from the eyes, with bark growing beneath his fingernails. When asked what happened, he wept and whispered, "She's not a tree, she's a doorway." And behind her, something bigger waits. Dot. The man who emerged from the forest, Agent Nolan Price, was no longer recognizable as federal law enforcement. His once crisp tactical uniform hung from his frame like loose skin, his mouth stained with soil, eyes red not from crying but from something internal, ruptured. The medical team tried to restrain him, but he screamed when anyone touched his hands, claiming his fingertips were listening. When asked what had happened to the others, Dr. Norwood, Deputy Reese, Agent Lopez, he looked up with cracked lips and said, "They didn't go through." It took hours before he could speak in full sentences, and even then, his words were laced with hallucinated geometry, as if he was trying to describe shapes that didn't fit human language. He spoke of roots not just in the soil, but in the air. "In the folds between moments," he said. "She's not growing upward, she's growing outward into everything, every second, every thought, every silence." He described the center of the forest, beyond the map's final circle, a hollow unlike any natural formation. Not cave, not chamber, more like a negative space that pushed the world away. There they had seen the truth. The mother root wasn't just a tree, she was the anchor of something older, something buried beneath dimensions. And the cult that worshipped her, the rooted path, were merely caretakers of an interface between worlds. "She is the door," Nolan repeated again and again, rocking in his chair. "And we were the knock." Medical scans later revealed bark-like calcification forming along his spine. His blood contained spores unknown to any laboratory. He died 3 days later when his veins ruptured, simultaneously. At 3:33 a.m., and with his death, the boundary began to rot. Across Mill Creek, the black saplings began to bloom, not into flowers, but into eyes, hundreds of them. Bulbous, translucent eyes growing from stems, opening simultaneously at dusk to stare in the same direction, southeast, toward the old reservoir. When investigators followed the gaze, they found the ground near the waterline pulsing faintly, and on its banks, a figure, Layla Jang, unaged, drenched in lake water, her hair matted with moss, her dress stitched with vine thread. She didn't speak. She simply turned and walked into the woods. The drones that followed her lost signal one by one, but the last camera caught a final frame. Layla entering the forest and being met by others, students long thought dead. They walked without urgency, without fear, as if time itself bent around them. Their eyes were dark, but not hollow. They looked returned. Days later, the old school building, Mill Creek Academy, was consumed by a swarm of vines that burst through the foundation like veins seeking open sky. The structure collapsed inward, as if pulled underground. No alarms, no seismic activity. Just a slow implosion and silence. Survivors said they heard a single word on the wind afterward. Welcome. It wasn't long before the phenomenon expanded. Nearby towns began experiencing similar black saplings, sprouting in cemeteries, schools, and abandoned churches. Children were heard whispering in their sleep about the girl in the tree and the place where names fall off. Weather patterns began to shift. Night arrived earlier. Plants began growing at accelerated rates, but with strange mutations, spiraled leaves, translucent stems, thorns that bled amber. One child in Fairbanks drew a crayon image of his family at dinner, seated with a shadow at the table. "That's our cousin," he said. "She came from the forest. We forgot she was missing." The government issued a full blackout on all information regarding Mill Creek. The forest was declared a restricted site. Satellite images were scrambled, but whispers still spread. Online forums documented sightings of people walking along highways barefoot at night, stopping only to stare into fields or bury their hands into the dirt. One by one, the families of the missing students began to receive letters, aged parchment sealed with twisted bark, containing single sentences in familiar handwriting. "She let us grow." These weren't mere hauntings. This was colonization, an infection of memory and soil. Something beneath our understanding had waited for a vessel, for a host mind strong enough to carry its signal beyond the tree line. And it had found one. Devin Carter, though still locked in his coma, began to hum nightly, a sound unlike anything human. Audio technicians isolated the frequency and discovered an embedded pattern in the waveform. It matched seismic pulses detected beneath Mill Creek, rhythms that mirrored root expansion deep underground. The implication was undeniable. His brain was echoing her pulse. Whether conduit or prisoner, Devin had become the forest's amplifier. And now, she was calling to more. The task force, now reduced to a skeleton crew of believers and those with nowhere else to go, faced one final decision: leave and seal the perimeter forever, or descend into the hollow one last time, not to rescue, but to ask. What does she want? And more terrifying, what if she's already getting it? They entered the forest at dusk, not because they chose to, but because that was when the threshold allowed passage. The remaining task force, now reduced to 5, carried no weapons. They had learned the hard way that bullets didn't work on things without blood. Instead, they brought what the forest might recognize: memory. A locket, a yearbook, the worn cassette recorder with Rachel Wu's last voicemail. They crossed the final ring at 6:06 p.m., and the forest swallowed the light behind them. No GPS, no radio, only the faint sound of breath and leaves shifting like whispers beneath their boots. The deeper they moved, the more the forest bent, not physically but perceptually. Paths folded into themselves. The trees leaned subtly in their direction, and the air grew heavier, like they were walking underwater. At 6:33 p.m., they reached the place marked Mother Root on Devin's map. But the tree had changed. It was larger, impossibly so. Its bark split in vertical ridges that pulsed with a slow, heartbeat-like rhythm. The hollow at its center, once only a dark cavity, now glowed with soft amber light, like something inside was breathing through the wood. And the ground around it was no longer soil, it was woven. Veins of root hair, and moss braided into a surface that shifted slightly as they stepped. None of them spoke. Agent Vega, the youngest of the group, reached forward and placed the yearbook at the base of the tree. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the bark opened. Not with violence, but like the parting of lips. Inside was not rot or darkness, but a passage of spiraling roots forming a tunnel, humming faintly with a low, living sound. And from within it, a voice, not spoken, but felt. "You remember us now?" The air turned warm. Too warm. Officer Delaney stepped back, but the tunnel seemed to stretch toward him, vines brushing his boots like fingers. They had no choice. They entered. The descent was not measured in distance, but in emotion. Each step forward was a memory. Loss, fear, guilt, unfolding around them in flickering glimpses. Devin's trembling voice narrating the bus breakdown. Layla's charcoal sketches crying from sketchbook pages, the moment Jared Boone vanished into the clearing. The tunnel bent deeper, and with each curve, the world they'd known peeled away. Time unraveled. At one point, Agent Vega swore she saw herself as a child, standing in her old kitchen, her mother's face melting into bark. They tried to record, to document, but electronics ceased functioning. Only the human mind was allowed to witness. Eventually, the tunnel widened into a chamber, vast, circular, and alive. The ceiling was lined with bioluminescent pods, each one pulsating with light. Inside them, faces, young, familiar, peaceful. The students of Mill Creek, floating in a dreamlike suspension, their mouths moving in unison though no words came out. In the center stood Layla Jang, eyes closed, hands raised as though conducting something far greater than herself. Roots extended from her wrists into the chamber walls. She wasn't trapped. She was connected. Agent Vega stepped forward, her voice cracking. "Layla, why?" Layla's eyes opened, slowly. No anger, no fear, only acceptance. "We were chosen to remember what the world forgot," she said, her voice not echoing but embedding itself directly into their minds. The old language, the old hunger. You paved everything, built over her. But she waited. We listened. Officer Delaney shook his head, trembling. "You're being used. This thing, this entity, it's not life. It's parasitic." Layla stepped closer. "She is life. Before your gods, your cities, your science, she sang the first forest into existence. You call it infection. We call it inheritance." From the chamber walls, vines began to twitch. The faces inside the pods smiled. The roots along the floor brightened with amber light. Devin ran, Layla continued, but even he knew the circle wasn't complete without him. Agent Vega asked, "Then why bring us here? To finish it?" Layla paused. "To offer choice." The chamber dimmed, the tunnel behind them sealed with soundless closure. You can carry her outside, let her breathe through you, or stay, and be part of the memory forever. Both are honored. Then, from the wall behind her, a new pod began to open. Slowly, reverently. Inside it, Devin Carter, awake, smiling, no longer afraid. He looked at them and whispered, "It's not death. It's becoming." Agent Vega reached for her shoulder camera, forgetting it had long since died. Delaney backed against the wall, muttering prayers. Two of the others dropped to their knees, tears streaming, not of fear, but something like longing. The chamber pulsed again. The mother root waited, and above, far beyond the surface, the saplings began to open, not as flowers, but as mouths dot. The world above no longer noticed when the wind shifted. In towns once miles from Mill Creek, children woke screaming in languages their parents didn't understand. Guttural, rhythmic chants that matched the pulse of saplings blooming in the fields. Crows flew in concentric spirals over playgrounds before crashing dead into the ground. Rivers swelled overnight with darkened water that tasted of iron and ash. Something was moving beneath the surface of everything. Not fast, not violent, but certain. At the edge of the Black Bear Preserve, the trees grew thicker and closer together, forming natural gates that opened only to the willing, or the remembered. Agent Vega had not moved in hours. She knelt in the glow of the chamber, her hands trembling in her lap, eyes locked on Devin's soft, peaceful smile. He didn't speak again, but the message inside her skull repeated, low and slow, "You're already part of it." Behind her, Officer Delaney pressed a flare to the root-lined wall, hoping to burn his way out. but the flames flickered and died the instant they touched the bark, snuffed not by lack of fuel, but by choice. The forest would not allow violence here, not anymore. Layla turned to him, not with anger, but sadness. "You can't fight what you forgot," she said gently. "You left her behind long ago. You paved her lungs, built towers through her throat. She remembers everything." From the chamber ceiling, one of the pods began to lower on a thick vine, swaying like a cradle. Inside was Rachel Wu. Her eyes were open. She looked directly at Delaney. Her mouth moved. He took one step closer, and her voice echoed, not aloud, but deep in the marrow of every listener, "You mourned me, but you never listened." Delaney screamed, drawing his sidearm out of instinct. But before he could raise it, the weapon unraveled, melted into vines between his fingers, and from the floor, roots wrapped softly around his ankles, pulling him to his knees, not cruelly, but as if inviting him to finally rest. And then he wept. Agent Vega rose slowly, stumbling toward Devon, toward Layla, toward the humming tree that stood at the center of it all. "Why now?" she whispered. "Why return after all these years?" Layla's expression never changed. "Because the forgetting reached its end. Because you taught generations not to see her. But we remembered." She called, and the class of 2001 answered. The chamber pulsed. For a moment, Vega saw it all. Her childhood forest, flattened for strip malls. Her grandmother's orchard paved for a freeway. She saw fires lit in sacred groves, and the soil screaming in silence. She saw names erased, languages buried, memories overwritten by concrete and steel, and behind it all, something waited. Not angry, not vengeful, only patient. Mother Root. The consciousness not of one tree, but of the memory of trees, of all living things forgotten, of soil before history, and now, the bloom. Layla stepped forward and placed her hand on Vega's chest. "You still have time to decide. Leave and speak, or stay and root." One feeds her mind, the other her body. Behind them, the pods began to shift. The faces within them started to vanish. Not decaying, not dying, just fading. Becoming part of the walls, the roots, the pulse. They had bloomed. They had finished remembering. And now they would rest. Vega turned to Devon. "If I leave, what happens to me?" His smile was gentle. "You carry her. You become her echo. And she learns from you." The chamber brightened. Somewhere above, trees burst into sudden blossom, petals the color of bone falling into the streets of Mill Creek. Every blossom was an eye. Every eye was watching. In neighboring towns, people awoke speaking names they didn't recognize, names of students long gone. One man in Boise carved the name Layla Zhang into his wooden floor while sleepwalking. In Helena, a baby said its first word, Devon. No one knew the name, but the forests did. Back in the hollow, Officer Delaney had stopped struggling. His chest rose and fell in rhythm with the tree. A smile spread across his face, too wide, too calm. "I remember now," he said. "I remember the dirt. I remember the lullaby." And with that, he fell still. His body remained, but his self was gone, transplanted somewhere deeper. Agent Vega looked once more at the open tunnel. It had reappeared, leading back to the surface, winding like a root. Layla didn't follow her. Devon didn't look away. The chamber dimmed. The choice hung in the air like pollen. Forget and survive, or carry and awaken. She turned, slowly, and stepped into the tunnel. Her footsteps were silent. But above her, in towns that had never heard of Mill Creek, saplings cracked sidewalks. Roots split foundations, and a low hum began beneath the earth. Not of machines, not of monsters, but of memory, blooming. When Agent Vega emerged from the forest, it was not with triumph, but with silence. The sky above Mill Creek was bruised with overcast light, and the air tasted like damp wood and old stone. Her boots touched grass that didn't remember being grass. The trees around her bowing not from wind, but from recognition. Behind her, the tunnel had closed, not collapsed. Closed, like a mouth after a long exhale. She stood at the edge of the preserve, alone, clutching the yearbook that should have decayed decades ago, its cover pristine, its pages unwritten. Her eyes were glassy, distant, not blank, but full, like someone who had seen something so vast it eclipsed thought. The few remaining responders who saw her approach backed away instinctively. Her presence carried weight, not physical, but atmospheric. One ranger dropped to his knees without knowing why. Another vomited. Vega did not speak. Not at first. She sat by the fire pit of the now abandoned base camp and stared into the ashes of old reports, burnt maps, forgotten intentions. When asked what had happened, she simply said, "She is remembering." It took 3 days before Vega spoke again. Not to a crowd, not to the media, but to the only person who hadn't fled, an intern named Malik who had stayed behind to catalog field samples. Young, skeptical, and quietly terrified, Malik offered her coffee, which she didn't touch. Instead, she handed him the yearbook. Inside, every page contained a name from the Mill Creek class of 2001. Except now, next to each name, was a line of script he didn't recognize. Not English, not any language in their database. But somehow, he understood it. Returned to soil, remembered in breath. Roots beneath memory. "What is this?" he asked. Vega looked at him, and for a moment her irises shimmered like amber caught in sunlight. Their names were never lost, only waiting to be heard again. Dotisi. From that moment, Vega became the unspoken center of what came next. The federal government sealed Mill Creek under the highest level of containment, but nothing could stop what had already begun. Across the country, reports surfaced of children singing to trees, entire forests growing rings of mushrooms that matched no known species, hikers vanishing for hours and returning with muddy feet and no memory of where they'd been, but with drawings of symbols they'd never learned. In Chicago, a woman painted a mural across an underpass without permission, a sprawling forest with a tree at its heart whose trunk formed the face of a young girl. The artist claimed she didn't know who the girl was, only that she needed to be remembered. Vega watched these reports from afar. She didn't return to her agency. She didn't answer calls. She lived in a cabin near the woods, where the black saplings grew faster than anyone could explain. And every morning she awoke with dirt beneath her fingernails. But she wasn't decaying, she was blooming. Her skin glowed faintly at night, like fungus in dark caves. Her breath fogged glass in spirals, and when she walked, the birds followed her in complete silence. The press dubbed her the Echo. But those who met her face to face didn't speak of headlines. They spoke of presence. They spoke of feeling remembered. One survivor, a firefighter named Teresa Ward, broke her silence after a private meeting with Vega. She told reporters, voice shaking. She didn't say anything. She just looked at me. And for a moment, I remembered a place I've never been. A lake surrounded by trees, and in the center, a door made of bark. And I wanted to walk through it. Scientists attempted to study Vega, but their instruments failed. EEGs shorted out. Blood samples turned to sap. Cameras recorded her face flickering between frames, blurred, like she wasn't quite fixed in space. When one biologist compared her DNA to old records, he found something terrifying. It still matched Vega's federal profile, but there were anomalies, an extra strand, a new pattern, as if something ancient had written itself into her genome. Not overwritten, intertwined. The conclusion was clear. Vega wasn't possessed, she was partnered. And while they debated how, Vega whispered to the wind, not madness, communion. "She's looking for the others," she said one night to no one in particular, "the ones who listen in their sleep." And she was right. Around the world, others like her began to surface. Not many, just enough. A boy in Morocco who could draw the forest from memory despite never leaving his town, a girl in Sweden who recited the names of missing Mill Creek students in her sleep, a deaf woman in Peru who woke speaking the symbols etched into the mother root. These were not accidents, they were seedlings, and Agent Vega, the Echo, was the first blossom. She no longer wore a badge, she no longer carried a gun. She walked barefoot now, through soil that parted gently for her steps. And wherever she passed, the trees leaned in just slightly, as if remembering her, or awaiting instruction. It began not with fire, nor with war, but with silence, an unnatural hush that blanketed the globe as if the air itself had forgotten how to carry sound. In Tokyo, traffic ground to a halt as radios emitted low hums tuned to no known frequency. In Johannesburg, power grids flickered not from overload, but from indecision, as if electricity itself hesitated. Across the northern hemisphere, weather patterns unraveled. Clouds formed into spiral shapes, hovering motionless for hours before raining pollen the color of bone. The news was unsure how to report it. Some called it an ecological phenomenon. Others whispered about mass psychogenic illness. But for those who had seen the footage leaked from Mill Creek, the truth was already rooted too deeply to ignore. The mother root had opened more than a door. It had sown memory into the biosphere, carved awareness into soil and synapse alike. And at the center of this slow bloom stood those who carried her echo. Agent Vega, now known among underground circles simply as She Who Returned, was no longer bound by place. She moved between forests with impossible ease. Witnesses claimed she was seen on the outskirts of Rainier one morning, then walking through a swamp in Louisiana that same night. Her presence left no footprints, only rings of mushrooms and the faint scent of cedar. People who encountered her often broke down crying, not out of fear, but of recognition, as if something buried deep inside them had finally come home. One journalist, desperate to understand, tracked her for 6 days before losing her trail in a burned-out orchard in Northern California. When he reviewed his footage, he found his voice had been replaced, not silenced, but overwritten. In place of his narration, a calm, layered whisper repeated, "They buried her beneath time, but time is made of roots." He never spoke again. Scientists, unable to explain the seismic harmony spreading between ancient forests, began to admit what they once denied. Patterns were forming, root systems linking across continents, trees communicating in pulses and frequencies that mirrored human circadian rhythms. And in the heart of it all, at the exact geographical center of every major cluster, abandoned schools, forgotten classrooms, empty auditoriums, places once filled with children who had stopped listening to the forest. The mother root had not chosen adults. She had chosen the remembered, the mourned, the lost, and those who had carried grief like lanterns. Governments tried quarantines, then fires, but forests regrew faster than flames could spread. Satellites failed to image Mill Creek after June 18th, their lenses showing only static or images of the same lone tree, regardless of position or angle. A tree with no visible leaves, but 1,000 eyes in bloom. And the people changed. Not all, but some. They wandered into woods barefoot and returned speaking in symbols, their veins tinted amber. Others disappeared for days and came back with knowledge, how to grow food in poison soil, how to hear frequencies beneath the range of speech, how to dream in the old language. They were the seeded, not possessed, not infected. Translated. In the days that followed, Agent Vega emerged once more, not alone, but flanked by 6 others, children, teenagers, elders, each marked by spirals on their palms, each silent but radiant, as if lit from within. They stood at the mouth of the Black Bear Preserve before a crowd of onlookers, journalists, and those still clinging to reason. Vega lifted a single hand. "She remembers all of you," she said, "even those who paved her, even those who burned her name from the soil. She offers mercy, but not ignorance. You will remember now." And at that moment, everyone in the crowd saw something. Visions not shared, but uniquely tailored. One man saw his childhood dog, buried under a tree he chopped down to build a garage. A woman saw the orchard her grandmother once tended, before it was sold to developers. A boy saw a sister he never met, one who had vanished before he was born. Memory bloomed like infection, and it was irreversible. On the anniversary of the class's disappearance, the final broadcast was aired. A grainy, flickering video from inside the original school bus. Long lost, but suddenly found again on every screen. Devin Carter stood at the front, smiling calmly. "We weren't taken," he said. "We were remembered, and now we are you. There is no rescue, only return." The feed cut to static. No agency ever claimed the footage. No one could trace its origin. But that night, millions of people across the world dreamed the same thing. A classroom where the chalkboard bled roots and a tree grew through the ceiling, whispering the names of those they'd forgotten. The world did not end. It changed. Quietly. Slowly. Without fire or collapse. Just soil. Just memory. And in the places people once feared to tread, something older than humanity now waited. Not for permission, but for acknowledgement. It was quiet the way snowfall is quiet. Soft, complete, and absolute. No more broadcasts, no more alerts, no more resistance. The world had not collapsed, only shifted. People still lived their lives, still went to work, still shopped, still laughed. But something beneath all of it had changed, as if an unseen layer of soil now existed in every word, every breath. In cities, trees grew faster, not taller, but smarter, leaning toward playgrounds where children sang lullabies they swore no one had taught them. In fields, crops began sprouting in patterns resembling root spirals, each harvest timed to the phases of the moon. No one called it supernatural anymore. It was just what was. The change had become so gradual that those who remembered before were considered relics. Conspiracy theorists tried to frame it as mass hypnosis, but even they forgot their own arguments by dusk. Because the forgetting was over. The remembering had begun. And through it all, Agent Vega, if she could still be called that, walked. Sometimes she was seen in forests, sometimes on rooftops. Once, she was spotted in the reflection of a lake, even though the shore was empty. Her body had softened, skin almost luminous, her voice rarely used but always heard. She was the bloom of a memory too large for one person to carry, and so she did not carry it alone. All around the world, those once called seeded had become the chorus, the second ring of voices humming the root's name across soil and sky. The class of 2001 was not gone. They had not died. They were the first layer of the new remembering, the roots of the new world. Their names no longer appeared on tombstones or in police files, but in the wind patterns through the trees, in the markings that children drew instinctively in their notebooks, in the dreams shared by strangers in far-flung villages who all whispered the same word in their sleep. Home. Devin Carter, whose voice had once trembled with guilt and terror, had become the echo beneath Vega's steps. He no longer had a body, only a presence woven into the hum of the world. On the anniversary of their disappearance, Vega returned to the site of the bus, not with ceremony, but with silence. The bus was gone now. In its place grew a single colossal tree, impossibly tall, with bark like petrified memory and leaves shaped like open hands. At its base, etched not with tools but with time, was a circle of 28 names, the students and teachers of Mill Creek. Beneath each name, a new word had formed, one not from any language, but understood by all who saw it, remembered. Vega placed the last artifact, a cassette recorder, now blooming with moss, into a hollow of the trunk, and the tree pulsed once, as if satisfied. The sky darkened briefly, not with storm, but with shade, as if something immense had leaned down to listen. And then, for the first time in 22 years, Vega smiled. Across the world, others paused mid-conversation, mid-stride, mid-thought, and in that pause, they remembered everything. Every lost name, every unmarked grave, every forest buried beneath parking lots. They remembered the smell of cedar in childhood rain, the way soil clung to fingers like longing, the way silence could be sacred, not empty. And in that mass remembering, the root was complete. Not victorious. Completion had never been about conquest. It had always been about return, about balance, about listening. Those who resisted were not punished. They were simply left behind, untethered, unrooted, floating in a world that no longer required them. But most chose to plant themselves in the truth, to bloom in it, to sing. And so, the story ended not with death, but with growth. The vanishing of the Mill Creek class was no longer seen as tragedy, but as a beginning, a whisper that became a bloom that became a world. And now, when people walk beneath trees and feel the wind shift, they do not ask, "What is that?" They whisper instead, "I remember you." And the trees, if you listen closely, always whisper back. Some stories end with justice, others with closure, but this story ends with roots, with echoes beneath our feet, and memories stitched into the trees we've long forgotten to see. The Mill Creek class did not vanish. They became part of something older than fear, older than time, a voice buried in soil, finally heard again. And now, wherever the wind rustles through a forest untouched, wherever children hum songs they were never taught, wherever dreams taste of cedar and earth, we know. The remembering has only just begun. So the next time you find yourself alone in the woods and everything goes still, don't ask if you're being watched. Ask if you've been remembered. Thank you for walking with us. And remember, some roots grow upward,